Hi all, and thanks for joining us to hear an update on the global shipping challenges facing the Australian grape and wine sector from international logistics company Hillebrand, and for an update on changes to VI1 certification requirements for Australian wine imported to the UK. Before we begin, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land.
We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani salt bush peoples of Margaret River in our west to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation and the Southern Island and Salt Bush peoples of the Nione peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
I would also like to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the traditional country of the Kaurna people in the Adelaide Plains and to pay respect to their elders past and present. And we also extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations. Good afternoon, I'm Rachel Triggs, General Manager, Corporate Affairs and Regulation at Wine Australia. I'll be your host today and I'll also present a little later on VI1 certification. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping information. At the right of your screen, you'll find a chat and a QR function. To join the conversation, you can post directly into the chat. To ask a question, simply click on the Add to QA button. We have experts behind the scenes from both Hillebrand and Wine Australia who will endeavour to answer as many as your questions as we can throughout the session. And if time permits, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation for some questions. Any questions we can't answer today will be followed up after the session, and a recording of today's webinar will be emailed to all attendees tomorrow. Lastly, if you're having technical issues, we recommend that you refresh your URL or browser or pop a question into the chat. Now let's begin. Our global shipping update today is in partnership with global logistics experts Hillebrand. We have two presenters joining us, Emmanuel Oliver, Group Ocean Freight Director, located in the beautiful Beaune in France, and a little more local, joining us from Adelaide is Joan Massili, Oceania Procurement Manager. Welcome to you both. We're looking forward to your insights on the current shipping challenges facing the Australian grape and wine sector.
Thank you, Rachel, for the kickoff and for the introduction. Thank you, Wine Australia, for the opportunity to present and to attend this webinar and to try and provide all of you with an update indeed on global shipping and the liner environment in the industry today. Just moving the slides back to the beginning. So I am Emmanuel, as you just mentioned. Rachel, I'm based in France. I'm running ocean freight procurement for Hillebrand. Hillebrand, as most of you would know, we the leader into beverages and wine logistics. Arguably everything which is indeed wine, beer, spirits, as well as any other product that requires special care. NVO wine leader into that segment. I'm not gonna go through a detailed company presentation. This is not the topic for today, but you know where to find us, whether in Australia, New Zealand, or anywhere else in the world. And we are here basically to cover your needs, whether export or import, on every single trail lane, every single country, every single maritime route in the world. The purpose of this presentation today is to indeed try and provide an update on what's happening with global shipping. It's in all the media, a lot of description out there, a lot of effects which make the logistics and your logistics complicated today. So the objective is to try and depict a little bit what the picture is like, what's the situation today, what are the challenges that we are facing, how did we get there? I could have called that as well, like shipping wine in a pandemic. What does it take? What does it mean? Because a lot of unusual, indeed, situation or events are impacting us on a day-to-day, all of us. It's a challenge to go for this because obviously a lot of the traditional elements are broken, so to speak. I will try, however, not to scare anybody away because even things are complicated. We have solutions out there to help you maneuver your flows, to respond to your importers, to get your flows inbound in Oceania, of course. Nothing is as simple as it used to be, but of course we do have solutions. I think it's important to understand where we are today, where we're coming from. So if I want to rapidly depict the situation today, I would just say this is just unprecedented. Never heard of before. We have never been in a situation like this. And I would just keep 3 global elements. The number one is that ocean freight rates are at record levels ever. Not in Australia, everywhere in the world. I'm trying to depict here a little bit of an overview of what the different freight indexes and major freight indexes in the industry are reporting. And you can easily see, especially on the left-hand side here, the Drewry, the Shanghai Container Freight Index, Xeneta or Freightos, for example, which are references out there in the markets, are all reporting freights which are 3, 4, 5 times higher than they were a year and a half ago. If you indeed then cascade that to specific trade lanes, here are just a few examples. We are really today seeing that trend of non-stop rate increases on every single route in the world. At the same time, as we have these steep rate increases, we are with the worst ever schedule reliability performance. It means that whatever, if I use a shortcut, whatever you pay, you have only 35% guarantee that your cargo will be delivered on time. It's a result and a consequence of multiple factors. Not all of them are attributable actually to the shipping lines, but we will try to understand what's happening and how did we get to such lousy performance. I just use here on the screen one example to illustrate that global situation. Here we're looking at the Asia to North Europe trade. Since spring or European spring, we have basically 20% of the vessels which do make it on time. Obviously, an impact and an immediate challenge for managing logistics, managing inventories, and really getting the right visibility as to when your goods are shipping, are sailing, and are arriving. At the same time, ocean freights, ocean carriers, are posting record profits ever. They are obviously benefiting from the situation with the disrupted supply chains. We have never seen, the industry has never recorded that level of profitability for the ocean carriers. Maersk Line, just to name one, the number one in the world, has communicated early September that their expectations for 2021 would be an EBIT of around 22 billion. I'm not putting that on the screen to finger point at the shipping lines forum or to suggest that they are overly profiteering from a situation. This is just a reality for the shipping line industry after decades of loss making, which has led to so much consolidation in the industry, which has led a few years ago to the demise of ocean carrier Hanjin, for example. After so many decades of indeed a very, very poor performance, things seem to turn around today because of the pandemic, because of COVID, and because of a totally disrupted supply chain situation. Again, it's not to finger point at the carriers. I mean, these results today also enable them to invest into terminals capacity, into more ships, into more containers, into also the next generations of more environmental friendly fuels, because regulations will evolve, and these are going to also be costly developments for the shipping industry. This situation today will obviously enable the carriers to indeed think forward. That is a reality. They are posting profit records, which sometimes can be misread, misaccepted, and interpreted by the different stakeholders in the industry. When everybody is struggling to get their goods on the shelves, that is a reality, and there's no reason to shy away from it. This is what is happening today. So how did we get there? Record ocean freights, record profits for shipping lines, and the lousiest service levels that the industry has ever witnessed. First, we still with very, very strong container demand. This year, we're going to probably hit 13 to 15% global container growth. It's still 6 to 7% increase compared to 2019, the year before pandemic. So there's a real need for containers. There's a real need for capacity, which is indeed obviously not impacting, but which is driving a lot of the actions which shipping lines are taking. You can see here on the screen that even North America, and you see on the right-hand side, New York, Houston, but essentially Los Angeles and Long Beach are recording record performance month after month. The truth is actually true for whether it's Asia or it's Europe or it's Latin America, where most ports, if not all in the world, are truly experiencing record flows and record demand. We are obviously here comparing with 2020, which is a little bit of biased in a way, because Q2 last year was very weak, right, at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdowns. Still, when you have Long Beach, California, especially, we was still posting 40, 60, over 100% growth on some specific months. This is way, way higher than 2019, obviously. So global demand with very, very strong capacity needed. And indeed, capacity has been deployed by shipping lines to respond to that demand. We obviously have to go back a little bit in history, right, to understand the whole chain of events. Late 2019, early 2020, the start of the pandemic, a lot of the capacity was withdrawn by shipping lines because demand did collapse when most countries and regions in the world were in lockdown and factories closing. The needs for container demand on all seas actually dropped between 15 and 18%, especially in Q2 2020. So a lot of capacity was removed. After the summer, the rebound and the reverse happened, starting with the Trans-Pacific, Asia into North America. And the carriers have then started to re-inject that capacity. If you check that screen here, which is telling us what the story was on most trades this summer compared to a year ago, so July 2020, at when we started to exit from the lockdowns, and when carriers were had already started to pull capacity, you realize that on every single trade, literally every single trade in the world, more capacity was added to respond as reactively as possible to the rebound and to the renewed container demand. What is, however, contributing to the challenges that we have today is that capacity has been deployed largely, vastly on the Trans-Pacific, the most buoyant of all trades, the most demanding of all trades. Imports into North America from USA rebounded extremely strongly. And this is where indeed the carriers focused with their container and capacity supply. Arguably, if you deploy a lot of capacity, as you see here, on the Trans-Pacific and on the Europe to Asia trade, there's fewer capacity that is available to support also growing demand on other routes in the world. So that was obviously a choice by shipping lines to respond to first where the demand was the strongest. But the challenge that the industry is facing, and that the entire world is actually seeing as consequences today, living the consequences, is that, and starting with North America and starting with Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Oakland, the infrastructures cannot cope. You have to imagine that, and to remember that when the demand rebounded, and all of a sudden Chinese factories started to produce and to move the cargoes again, in many areas in the world, especially in Europe and in North America, we still had a lot of restrictions with manpower linked to COVID regulations, to COVID adjustments, right? So all of a sudden you have a boost of cargo coming to the ports, but be it with trucking capacity, with rail capacity, with warehouses capacity, and terminal capacity, totally in adequation with the sudden container demand and volumes which were coming to the port. That chart is just showing that whether you're in Europe, you're in Middle East, you're in South America, North America, the traditional supply chain patterns are broken. Liner services are not able to cope and to meet with their schedules. Again, it is not linked to the shipping lines themselves per se. It's largely, in this case, attributable to the incapacity of ports and intermodal networks, again, starting in North America, to cope with the demand. 7 days as an average waiting time for a ship in California. If you picture that reverse, it means that there's already one ship that is missing in the whole schedule to continue to operate a weekly service. There are some vessels today off California who have still been waiting for 20, 25, some 28 to 30 days, still waiting for a berthing window at the port. Many areas are complicated as you see, so it's really something that is impacting the entire landscape. As of today, we still have close to 70 vessels which are waiting for an access to the port in California. And some of these, like I said, have been waiting for quite some time. And these delays, they are absorbing and negating basically the capacity influx. And so demand rebounded, shipping lines were asked and did provide a lot of capacity to meet and to respond to the demand. But this capacity is effectively made ineffective by the inability of the ports to cope with it. You see here that it says estimated, right? That 13 in August and actually close to 14% in September of the total available capacity, ships on the water, are indeed rendered ineffective. If you compare that ineffective capacity with the total capacity which has been added by the carriers, so bringing all the ships which were put in the garage, so to speak, in the second quarter last year, plus all the new capacity that has been delivered by the shipyards in the last 18 months, we still have today a negative capacity growth estimated by Hillebrand to close to 800,000 TEUs, which are missing to effectively operate the cargo needs and to support the demand that continues to increase everywhere in the world. If I try to summarize briefly, this is just to suggest a bit of a resume. If you start from the top of a chart and to show how everything is intricately linked, we're starting with indeed an influx of capacity because the demand is back, but the ports and the intermodal networks struggle because of related or labor issues and constraints. Because of that, the vessels accumulate delays in the ports, eat up capacity and impact schedules reliability of the shipping lines, as we saw earlier. Many other external factors as well, which sometimes we tend to leave on the side, but weather, COVID cases, we have had two situations, for example, in Ningbo and Yantian recently, where because of the Chinese authorities' policy towards zero COVID tolerance, there was one case on the port and the entire port locks down completely for a couple of weeks. this has a dramatic impact on the ability of the carriers to indeed maintain schedule integrity and to deploy ships and maintain vessels where they should be. So erratic schedules, eating up capacity, obviously hitting availability of equipment. All these ships which are waiting in the ports with 20, 15,000 TEUs on the port and waiting for 1 week, 2, 3 weeks, it's as many containers which do not discharge and do not come back. All of that create under capacity. The under capacity is obviously pushing rates up, rates which are going or increasing because also of port congestion charges, because of equipment imbalances charges, because of way to imbalance a ratio between supply and demand. And let's call a spade a spade. The carriers also focus on the most remunerative routes, right? So when you have somebody that is willing to pay $20,000 from Shanghai to Long Beach versus another trade, I just take transatlantic as an example, where a container today from North Europe to the same Long Beach will cost $8,000-9,000. There is a vested interest for the shipping lines to bring the capacity where it pays more, right? Which is on the Trans-Pacific. As a consequence, it also, I call that contaminates. It's a little bit harsh, but it effectively contaminates the ability to bring the needed capacity on the other trades. And then congestion worsens because of erratic schedules. You have ports which are experiencing 5, 6, 10, 15 ships coming the same day, as opposed to one every other day, as an example. And it just cascades down the challenges to every single port, whether loading or discharge everywhere in the world. It's not a really exciting or funny or amusing situation, right? I sometimes call it's broken. I overdo it a little bit, but there is part of that because it's impossible today, any which shipping line that will guarantee a schedule with 3-4 weeks notice at an arrival date is only pretending they can do it. Any which service logistic provider can be Hillebrand giving you a guarantee that that container will be discharged on that day at the port is actually an expectation, but it's difficult to give you a 100% promise and guarantee because it does not exist. What we are going through today is a lot of very, very last minute changes by the shipping lines because they have to adapt to a very reactive and very dynamic situation, which forces them to make schedules adjustments very, very much last minute. So how do we move from there, and how do we see what comes next and what the solutions we believe are going to be? First, we have to, and you might have also with Wine Australia, elements confirming that trend or that visibility, that forecast for the future. But container demand outlook is pretty positive. It's pretty positive for a couple of reasons. Starting with North America, inventory levels are very low, still very low. And you see on the chart here, they've never been that low since end of last year, basically. There was a little bit of a rebound at the beginning of 2021 because of Chinese New Year and fewer volumes sailing from Asia, therefore less ships coming to California, and therefore you had the ability, and the ports had the ability to move some of the cargo which was stranded in ports. But now we're back to very, very serious situations. You read in all media that distributors and some retailers are anxious whether all the goods will be available for the end of the year season. It is a reality. At the same time, and this is over GDP forecast for 2022, it is still very, very positive. It's still very ambitious. Globally, we are above 4.5% forecast for 2022, a little bit less than in 21, but still higher than the previous years. So on the back of hopefully we getting out of the pandemic at some point, consumer confidence resuming and turning positive again, vaccination obviously accelerating in most parts of the world. There are expectations and positive expectations for global trade, which should support or should mean a continuity with strong volumes in the future. But at the same time, and I just mentioned before that we were today probably experiencing an undercapacity compared to 2019, a normal year, because of all the infrastructure delays, challenges, and congestion. This is very unlikely to change in 2022. Granted, and we see that with 23, a lot of the carriers have invested again in new capacity. They are seeing the need to support shippers in a yet a more reactive way. They are not going to fix the problems in the terminals, but they can try and assist by bringing capacity and ordering new ships and new containers to meet with the demand. Whether a new ship today will actually alleviate the problems is another question. Probably not, right? Because if you bring more vessels to the ports, it's not going to take the problems away. This morning there was an article or post in the US that US President Joe Biden has apparently agreed with some of the ports, starting with California, that they would kick off 24/7 working time. Let's see how this is effectively being delivered. But in the meantime, and for the months ahead, we are still going to navigate through undercapacity waters, undercapacity versus demand, because the actual amount of new ships, new buildings, which will be delivered next year, will be inferior to container growth expectations. And at the same time, not only means that disruption is likely, and as much as I hate to say, but disruption is likely to continue for some time. And I believe that until indeed the North American ports are able to improve basically their own productivity and their own performance, the situation will remain problematic. And the cost will remain high because of the imbalance between supply and demand, right? It's a free market, so to speak, but also because the operational costs for the shipping lines are also increasing very steeply. Something that we tend to forget because we had other challenges, but the fuel, for example, is at its highest in 3 years. This is going to be reflected by or into transport cost. Container ship charter rates, I said earlier that the carriers did bring back on the water the entire fleet of available container ships out there in the market. They are starting to order from the shipyards again, but this is going to take time before these new vessels are delivered. And in the meantime, they have deployed every single unit which was basically available on the water. And this is what is driving also for the shipping lines, the charter rates. I guess most of you are familiar with that, but the daily price, this is the daily price which a shipping line is paying for a vessel, depending on the size of a vessel. So obviously there's way many classes and types of vessels, but just to illustrate here some of the main units which are on the charter market, 6,000-8,000 TEU vessels. You pay today $140,000 and you have to embrace a contract for 3 years if you are a ocean carrier and you make a lease or you charter a vessel from a ship owner. When you pay $140,000 a day, when a year and a half ago for that same vessel you would pay $10,000 or $15,000 a day, obviously the mathematics are not the same. When you deploy your ship at that price on a voyage which is meant to be, say, 30 days, but this very vessel is going to wait for 2 or 3 weeks at the port before it can effectively operate and come back to its original port of loading or come back to its normal voyage. It's 3 weeks waiting at a port, which costs $140,000 a day, every single day. So this is also a reality for carriers, which they are taking into consideration when they are adjusting ocean freight. The way forward, if I want to try and conclude with some insights and positive directions, it is complicated. It is a very challenging landscape. It's going to clean up at some point, but not short term, and some areas will be more complicated than others. But I think what is what is key today in getting through this in a context which again is not going to be a buyer's market, so to speak, when disruption is going to remain strong. If I can only encourage shippers to indeed work on increasing inventories, on adapting 3 times provision, whether import or export, with your exporters or distributors. I can only encourage as well to focus and try to focus on longer term contracts where it's possible with very precise forecast. Why? Because carriers, in a context where everybody's knocking at the door to get access to more space, they will also favor or try to prioritize, I would like to say, more loyal shippers, as well as shippers committing and who are engaging on the longer term, as opposed to being too transactional, if I can use that word. When you deal with Hillebrand, and I'm not going to pretend that we have a solution to every single situation, but because we are niche and we are really focusing on the beverage commodity, starting with the wine, we have indeed very, very solid and engaged connections with our key partners, and we have a network of solutions as well besides ocean freight. That's why I mentioned LCL solutions for groupage, air freight when it's needed for some specific urgent flows if needed. We have a basket of solutions which should hopefully be able to look at and respond and look at some of the challenges we experience today. So again, not a simple and not necessarily a very exciting situation. These are the environment we are. This is the environment we're in today. We have solutions to propose. We have also to admit that there's nothing is risk-free. Things are not going to work smooth like they always used to work all the way to 2019, for example. We still have to be a bit more patient. But when we cooperate and we align and we anticipate, I think we are able to indeed hopefully cover for your needs in the best possible way. On these words, and we might take some more questions later. I see a few on the chat. I would like to now introduce Joe Marsili. So Joe is the Ocean Freight Procurement Manager for region Oceania, based in Sydney, and Joe will provide a bit of an insight on what this global situation means from purely an Oceania standpoint.
Obviously, we've had that global perspective from Emmanuel, but a couple of things to really zone in on in terms of what's been happening locally. One is across the ditch with Auckland. But Auckland congestion, there was delays since Q3 2020, particularly on vessels transiting New Zealand to from the US, which the services jointly called Australia and New Zealand. Delays reached up to 20 days for vessels to berth at some stage, and this obviously had a big flow-on impact around the Australian coast. Now that's improved going over the last 6 months, but for example, congestion surcharges still apply into and out of Auckland, so it's not fully sort of rectified yet. We talked about disruption elsewhere in the network cascading down with the US, with Asia, with Europe, but one thing I wanted to just take a minute or two on is what's happening in the industrial landscape in Australia, again with the Maritime Union of Australia, and this has been ongoing since Q2 2020. So just to give everybody a quick ready reckoner, if you look at, say, a total annual throughput or volume handled by the terminals in Australia of 9.1 million TEUs, and in terms of the actual stevedoring companies, the terminal operators, you've got basically 5 through Australia. Patrick's and DP World are the biggest, with both over 40% share of that 9.1 million, and they have operations essentially in every single capital city port except for Adelaide. In Adelaide, it's Flinders as the sole operator. In Victoria, there is also a third operator called VICT, Victoria International Container Terminals, and Hutchison Ports that have terminal operations in Brisbane and also in Sydney. But I guess the point is, Patrick's is pivotal. It's the biggest operator by far. And this is where there is an ongoing risk, everyone. The MUA, the status of their negotiation with the stevedores, normally the EBA negotiations happen every 5 years. They have been concluded with all of the stevedores except for Patrick's. Now, for Patrick's, there's been approximately 70 formal meetings held with the MUA since February last year in an attempt to reach an agreement. And there's been a concerted campaign by the MUA against Patrick's Sydney, firstly. In the second half of 2020, it got so bad with all the actions that were happening. There was severe congestion surcharges were implemented. That was for most of Q4. And of course, remember, this then has a domino effect on all the other ports throughout Australia, the ability to move containers around, move vessels around efficiently. Now, those congestion surcharges, it's been fairly quiet for Q1, Q2. Those congestion surcharges have been removed. The MUA has been fairly well behaved. But there's still no agreement. And since May, there have been 197 industrial actions against Patrick's, covering a lot of different terminals around Australia by the MUA. So where it stands today, Patrick's have issued the MUA with their final offer, if you like. And the interesting part of this is the final offer basically meets all of the MUA demands, except probably the key one as far as Patrick's is concerned, and that is one regarding having control of actually hiring. Okay, so quite a roadblock. And what does that mean at the moment? Also, in terms of what's happened in Melbourne, because the situation's been exacerbated by a COVID outbreak, there's been 3 cases at Patrick's in Melbourne, 109 close contacts. They're all in isolation at the moment, and this is essentially 40 to 50% of the usual workforce available. Now, what was supposed to happen was the MUA did have a raft of actions against Patrick's for October for Melbourne, but they've withdrawn it as a gesture of good faith, which is not surprising. But there is still actions going on in Fremantle and Brisbane for October. Sydney has just had actions completed and nothing else is planned. So what we're seeing on the delay side at the moment is Sydney probably 4 to 5 days, not expected to get worse unless some new actions come to the front. Brisbane is probably going to get worse to 2 to 3 days by next week. Fremantle can have delays up to 7 days, depending on vessel bunching. Some are good, but some are up to 7 days. And Melbourne is the real problem here in terms of we're looking at delays currently of 4 days, but this is going to get increase exponentially given the workforce restrictions. And so with Melbourne going potentially to 7 to 10 days very shortly, we are going to start to see evasive action on a lot of schedules. Now, that can include Melbourne or other ports. Now, that could be emissions, port rotation changes, cutting and running and not loading full complements of exports. A lot of those things will come to the fore as the shipping lines rectify their schedules depending on what's going on in Melbourne and the domino effect on other ports. So it's something very much to keep an eye on, and all of these things sort of happen at very short notice. And then a couple of other things on Australia as well. Even before all this industrial action, a lot of the vessels from the shipping lines were continuing to arrive off their berthing or contracted windows at terminals. Okay, and again, this is because of delays elsewhere in the network, whether it's New Zealand, US West Coast, coming down from Asia, or the effects coming down from Europe. So the schedules can still be erratic and unreliable and subject to change. Now, one of the side effects of this is on equipment. Moving equipment around the country, particularly empty equipment, and for a port such as Adelaide, which is so important for our wine, the majority of 20-foot containers for all the shipping lines has to be positioned in empty from a port like Sydney or Melbourne into Adelaide, and even 40-footers as well. And so under this scenario of very erratic schedules and what's happening in the ports with delays, the ability to efficiently position equipment also is at risk and is a real challenge. We've talked about the US West Coast services and also even singular services, for example, a shipping line like MSC that they run between Asia, Australia and New Zealand called Kiwi and Capricorn and take a lot of trans-Tasman business. It's very erratic. There's constant vessel emissions. There's constant port emissions both in Australia and New Zealand as well. So again, quite erratic. And interestingly enough, we looked at the schedule reliability globally, right? And let's just say the average globally is about 35% schedule reliability and about an 8-day delay in berthing. In Australia, and these are the July numbers, we basically are at less than 20%, so only 16%. So not only are we suffering because of what's going on elsewhere in the world, also with what's going on in Australia and to a lesser extent with New Zealand, with the ports and the port performance and the stevedores, it's impacting on that schedule reliability even more. The day delays are only 5.5, but again, given what's going to be happening in Australia probably through October and November, those delays are probably going to increase. And essentially, it doesn't matter where you look, whether you're looking at the vessels off Fremantle, off Adelaide, off Melbourne, or off Sydney, which is pretty calm at the moment, but all of them are showing a bunching, all of them are showing obviously delays sort of building in the network. So it's fragile, it's disrupted. The other thing I wanted to just finish up on is just to give a précis, if you like, as to the main trades, okay? In terms of what the destination is, what the normal port rotation is, current status in terms of disruption and also space, importantly, and I guess 2022. The first sort of table you're looking at is for the US string. So there's a couple of West Coast strings. The most important one, again, for the wine industry is that one for Adelaide that also calls Oakland. Now, it is severely disrupted because of what is going on the US West Coast. You know, when, as Emmanuel mentioned, when you've got vessels waiting up to 30 days to dock at Long Beach, Oakland was up to 15 to 20 days, but has improved. But then places like Vancouver, Seattle, which are on these runs as well, are all showing 7+ days. And one of the things that I would preface 2022 is dependent, obviously, really on what happens in Australia and New Zealand with the industrial, certainly Australia with the industrial and Patrick's. If that gets resolved by the end of the year, then we've probably got a good foundation, at least around Australia, to get sort of vessel integrity and schedule integrity back in, which gives the carriers then more confidence in sort of taking bookings. But then the double whammy is a lot will depend on what happens with the US West Coast. So, and that is the case. For the East Coast, even the East Coast, Savannah, Philadelphia, again, showing delays, 5 to 7 days coming in, and then, of course, exacerbated by that, the inland network not having the capacity to sort of efficiently deal with imports and exports. So again, very much dependent on how those things rectify themselves into 2022. I would think that, you know, no real or great change before the end of Q1, at least before we'll know a little bit more. And then just lastly, on some of the other trades, some of the key trades, with Europe and UK, we've got the direct service from Adelaide, which tends to all the ports in North Europe and the UK. Again, you know, what you've got to remember also is look at the touch points. Look how many ports they call on the way to Europe. The more the touch points, the more the potential for hitting delays, hitting congestion. All right. So at the moment, on that direct service, I mean, there is some schedule disruption again with what's happening around the ports. There is some space restrictions, but not as bad as what's happening to the US. And again, I think it looks relatively green for next year, depending on the Australian industrial situation. Transshipment to Europe is a little bit different because of obviously that leg from Singapore or Port Kelang, in case it's through Malaysia, up to Europe. There's obviously the local scheduling disruption, but there is severe space restrictions through Singapore, and simply that's because the carriers are looking at their portfolio of business, and when they can get $10,000 to $12,000 to $13,000 a container from Singapore to Europe, or from China to Europe through Singapore, they prioritise the space that way. But again, probably seeing that with the Australian situation improving, becoming less problematic, maybe by the end of Q2 in 2022. Now, with New Zealand, unfortunately, the legacy with New Zealand services are they very much piggyback on the services to the US West Coast and also the East Coast. And again, we've said they're severely disrupted, and really it is going to be very dependent on what's going to be happening, both Australia, New Zealand and the US West Coast to a degree, in terms of those services returning to some sort of normality. And then lastly, just on Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and through to China, again, looking at Adelaide, which would mainly transship through Singapore for China, for example. Again, the Australian schedule disruption is the key part at the moment. Moderate space restrictions, probably having to book a month or two in advance. And again, next year we don't foresee any great issues as long as the Australian situation's resolved. That was it, everybody, in terms of the local situation.
Thank you, Joe, for the I think very insightful and detailed overview of indeed the Oceania situation. I'm just going, before I hand over back to Rachel, I just wanted to allow myself another comment or illustration actually to complete what you were just explaining with the risks and the delays in Southeast Asia, Joe, and also because there was a question in the chat box with regards to Singapore. Just as an illustration, I was sitting with a key shipping line a couple of weeks ago actually, and I got into some internal sort of discussions where one of the trade manager that is handling Asia into Europe was showing me that on a total capacity of 45,000 containers a week, which they can effectively operate, they were having requests, booking requests for 120,000 containers a week, right? So getting demand for 3 times what they could effectively operate, which obviously illustrates a little bit the bottlenecks. On these words, thank you again, Joe. Rachel, I guess I hand over back to you for the next part of the webinar.
Terrific. Thanks, Emmanuel, and thanks, Joe. And to the participants, just sorry for the minor technical glitch we had in the middle there. We are potentially running over time, so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes talking to you about changes to VI1 certificates. Please continue to include to put your questions into the chat box, because I think we are going to run out of time at the end. So I want to provide an update on how the way that Wine Australia issues VI1 certificates is going to change slightly in the near future. Those of you on the coalface of exporting to the EU and to the UK will know that unless an exemption applies, such as consignments for under 100 litres and samples, wine exports to those markets must be accompanied by a VI1 certificate, often referred to as the dreaded VI1 certificate. It's not something that's specific to Australian wine, it's all wine imported to the UK and the EU. And those of you that already use Wine Australia's licensing and approval system, affectionately known as Wallace, may have noticed that Wallace now generates security encrypted VI1 certificates in PDF that can be downloaded from Wallace and subsequently printed or emailed. Now, before the end of the year, changes to Wallace will be deployed to give exporters the choice of either having Wine Australia print and post VI1 certificates, which is the current process, or alternatively, you will be able to opt to print and send the PDF versions of the documents produced in Wallace direct from the system. So exporters will be able to change their preferences each time they apply for shipping approvals. And just to be clear, the certificates will continue to be technically issued by Wine Australia as the competent body, as approved by the European Commission. So there's no changes to legislation or the process and requirement in that regard. and they'll continue to be issued after the date of departure indicated in the shipping application. So that means that exporters, their agents or their importers will be able to print or download VI1 certificates and provide them to the relevant EU or the UK authorities. So exporters will either be able to download those PDFs and simply send them via email to their agents or their importers, or they would be able to give their agents or importers access to Walla so that they can actually extract those certificates from the system themselves. Exporters will still be able to nominate for Wine Australia to print and post the VI1 certificates issued in Wallace if they prefer. Now, the other change that I want to share is that very pleasingly, the UK government has confirmed plans to remove VI1 certification requirements for imported wine. So again, not a dispensation that's being applied to Australian wine, but a change that's going to apply to all wine imported to the UK. Originally, we were told that these changes may be in place by the 1st of October. That's certainly not the case. There is still a consultation process that's being run by the UK government. And whilst we're not sure of the exact date that the change will occur, it is very likely to be in the new year, very unlikely to be before the new year. The changes are not immediate. UK law will need to be amended before the new arrangements can be adopted. And we'll obviously keep you informed as we receive further information about when that will occur. To be clear, VI1 certificates will continue to be required for imports to the EU, including for products that are exported from Australia to the UK and subsequently re-exported to the UK to the EU. So I did ask a colleague in Europe recently what the chances were of the European Union abolishing VI1 certificates, and he said in a very thick Spanish accent that it was somewhere between -5 and -2 out of 10. So I wouldn't be holding our breath for the elimination of VI1 certificates in Europe. So I want to talk just briefly about what that means for imports, Australian imports into the UK that are subsequently exported to the EU. So in those circumstances, the existing processes will remain, being that Wine Australia will provide a VI1 certificate to the Australian exporter, and a second VI1 will need to be obtained from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, in the UK and provided to the EU Customs Authority. So that's a process that's currently on foot. Wine Australia is continuing, I guess, to issue these VI1 certificates as if the exports were going to the UK, and then those certificates are being treated as what is referred to as a VI1 equivalent document by the United Kingdom, and that forms the basis of them being able to produce the certificate for entry into the European Union. And of course, that's a function of Brexit now that the UK is not part of the Common Customs Union in the EU. So once the UK abolish VI1 certifications, changes to Wallace will be deployed to give exporters sending wine to the UK an option as to whether they would like to receive a VI1 document from Wine Australia. So if the exporter expects that the wine will be imported to the UK and then subsequently re-exported to the EU, they should request a VI1 certificate through Wallace at the time of seeking export approval. But be warned that this change could create logistical problems in circumstances where an Australian exporter sends wine into the UK and doesn't anticipate that the wine will subsequently be re-exported to the EU. Now, if that were to occur and the party responsible for facilitating the export from the UK to the EU didn't have a VI1 certificate issued by Wine Australia for one reason or another, they'd have no other option other than to commission analysis of the wine in the UK by a laboratory accredited by the European Commission. And our understanding is that there aren't many of those. So you can imagine that might occur in situations where there's a broker type arrangement and hence an arm's length relationship between the party responsible for exporting the wine from the UK to the EU and the original exporter of the wine in Australia, which could cause logistical problems. Now, to make it easier, at any time following the export of wine from Australia, exporters will be able to go into Wallace and retrospectively request a VI1 certificate. So if they export wine into the UK, expecting that it won't then be reshipped to the EU and hence haven't asked for a VI1 certificate, they will be able to go back into Wallace and request a VI1 document from Wine Australia, provided that Wine Australia has been provided with a certificate of analysis from a NATA accredited laboratory in Australia. So Wine Australia cannot issue a VI1 certificate unless it has been provided with a VI1, a NATA accredited certificate laboratory analysis here in Australia. And that's a legislative requirement in EU law that's also enshrined in the Wine Australia European Wine Agreement. So obviously that won't be difficult if the wine's already been exported from Australia and samples have been retained, or if the analysis has actually been commissioned prior to it being exported. But I do just want to give everybody the heads up that it could cause logistical problems. We'll continue to update exporters on the timing of both the deployment of the changes to Wallace, allowing exporters to opt in or opt out of receiving paper copies of VI1s, and of the UK's progress in implementing legislation that will remove the requirement for a VI1 certificate to accompany wine imported into the UK, which will certainly be a great change. I've seen that there are a couple of questions in the chat, and we will endeavour to get back to you, those people who have put the questions in the chat after this webinar, given that we are almost out of time. A huge thank you to Emmanuel and Joe and to everyone who joined us today. Today's session has been recorded and we will email it to you. You'll receive a link to the session when it's live on the website. If you're considering exporting to the US, make sure you join us for our next webinars, Export Ready USA. This is a 2-part series which kicks off next week and provides wineries looking to export to the US with everything they need to know for the preparation and success in that complex market. Click on the link to learn more and to register. Thanks again for joining us at today's session, and we look forward to seeing you next time.